This morning what I want to do is I want to talk about the gospel. And before you check out and say, well, that's great, Roy. I've already accepted Jesus into my heart, so I don't need to listen to the gospel anymore. Let me just tell you and remind you that the gospel is actually for all of life. It's not just for the beginning, it's for the middle and the end as well. And the gospel, actually, if you open your New Testaments and were to look at the first few books, you would see that it says the gospel according to Matthew, and the gospel according to Mark and Luke and John. And what you have there in each of those four versions really is actually the condensed version of what the gospel really was. So that was the New Testament writer's way of saying, hey, we want to make this into a pocket version of what Jesus did in his life, and we want to give it to you on the go. So actually all of Matthew is the gospel, as is Mark, Luke, and John. And then we have this idea of gospel presentation. So what do we say when we're talking to people about the gospel? And that's kind of what I want to talk about this morning. And so I actually want to take and talk about the gospel presentation, looking back across all of Scripture. So we're going to be here for a while. That's a joke. We'll try to only do a half hour-ish. But we're going to look at sort of two versions, two tellings, two ways of sharing the gospel story. And I have found in my journey of 30 years of following Christ, and particularly the last 8 years as a missionary trying to help Christ be formed in others, that this understanding on where we start with God and where we start with the story of Jesus and the gospel presentation becomes very instrumental across all of our lives. If you think about it in Christianity, especially in evangelical Christianity, we always talk about it being a relationship, and so it is. So who God is and where we start with God becomes critically important. Because if we have any kind of animosity or fear or things that hold us back where that relationship is concerned, it's going to impact the rest of our lives, the other areas of our lives, as well as the duration of our lives. And I hope that I can make that clear. So this morning I want to start by using these chairs, and we're going to actually use these chairs the whole time, and we're going to tell the story from two different points of view. So the first point of view is a story, a presentation of the gospel that maybe you're familiar with. And the setting is that of a courtroom, kind of. It's a legal setting. It's kind of the idea of crime and punishment. And the story unfolds in that sense of there's been something that's done wrong, justice demands a correction, and so we'll see that played out. And so I want to tell this story from that point of view. So let's start at the beginning in Genesis. So in the beginning, here's God. This big chair here is going to be God. Is that all right? So here's God, and God loved, and God is love. And so out of God, out of his goodness, pours his love, and out of that love comes creation. And you see it there in Genesis. You've got the stars and the moon and the animals and the whole planet. It all comes together and it culminates out of God's love, and he creates mankind. So we'll let this little one to be mankind. Is that all right? So there's mankind. Okay? So you got God and you got mankind. And God is walking with mankind in the garden. And everything is going along well. God is interacting, and he set Adam and Eve to be over the whole creation. And you see it there. They get to name the animals. One of the big things about naming things means you have authority over them. So there's Adam and Eve naming things. But unfortunately, something goes wrong. Something goes bad, goes sideways in the garden. And Adam and Eve encounter and decide to go their own way. And so they actually, in their sin, they turn from God. And God is coming to look for them, and he finds out that he comes to them and he says, hey, what are you wearing? Because in their sin and their shame, they realized that they were naked. And so they clothed themselves in fig leaves. And they say to God, well, we clothed ourselves in fig leaves because we realized we were naked. God says, well, who told you you were naked? Well, the serpent, and there you have the blame game, and there it goes, right? But the point is that mankind has turned from God. And because God is holy and just and righteous, he must also turn from them. And so he puts them out of the garden. And there we see it. They've gone out of the garden now. And he sets the angels with the flaming swords and says, you can't come back in. But God is merciful, isn't he? He is merciful. It's true. And so he comes after them later and he says to them, to mankind, and there's Abraham. Later in the story, we see Abraham saying, Abraham, I've called you to be a great nation. I want you to be, from you is going to come all of the people and the Messiah is going to come from you, Abraham. And so God says, out of you, I'm going to give you a son, Abraham, and that son is going to bear the Messiah. And Abraham's like, that's great. God even calls him a friend, as we see like in Isaiah. It says, God says that Abraham, my friend. But Abraham, he's like, you know what? Sarah comes to him and says, do we really want to wait for God? I mean, look, man, you're 99 years old or whatever it was, 90, I guess he was at the time. Do you really want to wait that long? I mean, come on, you're getting old there, Pops. How about we take this situation into our own hands, and how about you take my girl, Hagar, which, let's be honest, what she really is basically a sex slave. Why don't you take her and make this thing happen? And so, in Abraham's insolence and his defiance, he turns from God's plan. And because God is holy and just and righteous, he also must turn from Abraham. And then we see the consequences of sin, don't we? And this whole people thing that goes on there with Ishmael and all the things that are happening there that are actually kind of bad, because sin is, and sin does have consequences, in fact. But then God, in his mercy, because he is merciful, he comes back, and later on we see now here's David. David is saying, okay, the people of God have grown, and out of you, David, specifically, I'm going to make you a great people. Out of you specifically is going to come the Messiah, and you'll be king, and all that kind of good stuff. And David's like, hey, that sounds great. I don't mind being king. Being king sounds kind of good. We can do this, God. And actually, in fact, we know God says of David, he's a man after his own heart. So David is a righteous man. But David has a problem. He also likes to take situations into his own hands. And as it happens, David loves hot tubs. And so David, in his sin with Bathsheba, turns from God and God's plan and God's orientation. And God, being holy and just and righteous, also has to turn away from that sin. And so it goes throughout the rest of the story, throughout the Old Testament. And God is always merciful. He establishes covenants and he sends prophets. And you've got these different scenes going throughout the Old Testament. But every time we see the same pattern happening, that humanity in the form of Israel is breaking the covenant and turning away from the plans of God. And God has to, in his righteousness and holiness, have to turn from them as well. Until we come to the New Testament, and God in his mercy again is saying, yeah, but I'm going to bring my son this time. And on one holy night, away in a manger in the first Noel, comes Jesus. And Jesus comes here and says, I am going to be what my Father wants to be in the revelation to humanity. And we see Jesus' story unfold, and it's fantastic because there's Jesus ministering to people and being with them. And he says of himself when he stands up in public ministry, he says, I'm going to restore sight to the blind and set the captives free. And what a great ministry. Here's the culmination of Jesus coming. And this is good. The mankind and God is being merciful to humanity. What a great story. It is, in fact, good news. But as we listen to the rest of the story in the New Testament, we see that then God has to deal with this unjust thing once and for all, because we see this pattern, turning and God having to turn, and yet God in his mercy coming. That's wonderful. But this pattern's got to stop. And so God says to Jesus, in the form of Jesus, let's break this pattern. And how about you become sin, who knew no sin? And Jesus, in his obedience, because he's God and a perfect man, says, yes, Father, not my will, but yours be done. And so then we see the cross. There's the cross, and God is having to pour out his wrath, because that's what justice is. God is pouring out his wrath on the Son. And he's experiencing incredible pain and separation, isn't he? In fact, in his becoming sin, we see the culmination there on the cross, where Jesus is saying, and he feels the worst of it, doesn't he? And he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it's tragic. Because now the Son of God and the Father are separated. They're turned. And there's Jesus going into the grave where God shouldn't be, but paying the consequence that only God could pay. And in the grave, because he didn't sin, because God in his mercy saw that he didn't sin, and his wrath has been satisfied, and his judgment and need for justice has been met. And so he raises Jesus from the dead. Praise be to God. And the story goes on from there, doesn't it? And so, of course, they become the people of God in the New Testament, and that becomes us. And that's why I say the gospel flows throughout all the rest of our lives. And that's a great story. There's a lot of good that has come out of this telling of this story. In fact, I was reminded a few weeks ago when I was in North Carolina for our big missions conference, going into this big camp in North Carolina, there's a huge statue of Billy Graham preaching the gospel. And it turns out that Billy Graham and I share a family tree lots of generations ago, 150 years or so, but at some point, Roy Graham and Billy Graham are brothers or something like that. Yeah, he might not claim it. Well, now he definitely doesn't claim it. But the point is that people like Billy Graham have told this story. People have come to the Lord through this story. I came to the Lord through this story. I know our pastor who's told this story from this pulpit has come to the Lord through this story at a Billy Graham crusade. You've said that up here so I can say it. Okay. This is good. This is really good. But I have also discovered, friends, and here's why I do this, is because in my ministry as a spiritual director and in my ministry of trying to help people grow in Christ, one of the things that I run into, the most common thing that I run into, is this notion that because of sin, God can't look on us. And because we start the story by telling the story that says God is holy, righteous, and just, which, by the way, of course he is. Of course he is. But because we're sinful, there's a separation between us. And now as we minister and try to tell people, hey, listen, God loves you, I run into this all the time, that people look at God and say, yeah, but his first disposition, his first thought of me is always one of turning, isn't it? I mean, isn't he mostly always mad at me? And if he hadn't visited his wrath and his justice on Jesus and sent Jesus into the grave, that would be me, wouldn't it? And in fact, don't we believe that unless you believe that Jesus did this for you and was raised from the dead, that actually there's a real possibility that you could go there? I mean, that's what we're talking about in the New Testament, that you could ultimately end up there. And so we have this bit of a crisis in this storytelling. And what has led me to really examine all of this, and why I bring it to you this morning, is that one of the key problems with this is that it pits God against mankind. And that makes it awfully difficult to grow. And if I ask you as a missionary to say, join me in the mission work of Christ, and go out and tell your neighbor, and your first story to them is that God is fundamentally against us, except for Jesus, it's going to be kind of difficult to trust that God. And this is just one man's opinion. You certainly can disagree with me. But I'm telling you, from my experience, this is the problem that I see consistently, is that we have God pitted against mankind. And worse than that, we have God pitted against Jesus. Because on the cross we have, why have you forsaken me? Why have you turned your back on me? And so again, please hear me on this. I think there's a corrective that's needed here, but this by itself is not a bad story, and lots of good has happened. And my distant cousin, brother, whatever Billy Graham was, has brought thousands of people to the Lord through this story, so it's a good thing. All I'm doing is suggesting what I have seen around the globe, and particularly in places like Europe and Asia, is that we need to tweak this story a little bit, and there's another way of looking at this. And rather than it being a courtroom, what if it's a hospital? What if rather than crime and punishment, it's sickness and healing? And so let's tell this story again from that point of view and see what we come up with. So in the beginning, here's God, and God, because he's love and merciful, and because he himself is relationship, and out of him pours love and mercy and grace, he wants to give that away because that's what love does. Love always gives itself away, always pours itself out. And so God, in his joy and in the Trinity form of God, says, let's share that out into creation. And all of creation comes into being out of love, specifically made from the fabric of relationship. And so here's Adam and Eve. created to be the image bearers, the imago Dei, as we might say in Latin, to say this is the image bearing of God, it's the expression of God's love. And I want you now, creation, and especially you, Adam and Eve, over all of creation, I want you to be my love, my glory, my Emmanuel, my God with you, my incarnation to all of creation. But there is a disease that enters into the story, and sin is a disease that happens in their hearts, and they say, maybe we don't need to rely on God. Maybe God's really not entirely for us the way we think He is. And so the disease of sin creeps in, and they find themselves turning from God. But what does God do? In His holiness and righteousness and in His mercy and justice, He is those things, but He's holy love, and He's righteous love, and He's just love. And so in those and His love in those ways, what does He do? He doesn't turn away from them. He comes looking for them. And He says, Adam and Eve, where are you? I've been looking for you, couldn't find you. And then, of course, He looks at them and says, what are you wearing? And there's the story again we've already heard. It's the same story. Well, because in their shame and whatnot they did, in fact, sin, and there is a disease in their heart, and they realize that they're naked. And so they do try to cover themselves. And what's God's reaction? He does turn them from the garden. And I suggest to you that He turns them from the garden and He goes with them. And the reason why He turns them from the garden is because if they eat from the tree of life, they'll get stuck in that diseased state. And they won't be able to get out of it. And so He says, for your own good, for justice and love and mercy, I'm going to send you out, but I'm going to go with you. And how do we know He goes with you? Well, because the next major characters in the Old Testament is Cain and Abel. And there's Cain plotting to kill his brother because he's jealous. And so his disease has turned him from the ways of God. But what does God do? Does God turn His back? No, He doesn't. He comes and looks for him. And He says, Cain, where are you? What are you doing, man? Why are you plotting to kill your brother? And he says, well, I'm not. It's none of my business. Whatever, I'm not. Don't. And then, but God says to Cain, death is crouching for you at the door. Be careful. And yet He does. He does kill his brother. And what's God's reaction? Does He turn from him? No, He doesn't. He comes looking for him again, and He says, you've done this thing. You've killed. That's not good, obviously. And you do have to separate. You do have to go out, but I'm going to go with you. How do we know that? Because as He turns Cain away, and Cain goes and forms the first civilization. And the first civilization is built on death and murder. Isn't that interesting? A story for another day. But does God turn away from Cain? No, actually He doesn't. He sets a mark on Cain's head and says, you know what? I'm going to go with you. I'm still going to be with you, Cain. Put a mark on your head that says, actually, that way no one can kill you. And so it continues to unfold as we see the different stories. Here's Abraham, same story. Abraham says, God says to Abraham, we're friends, and we're going to make out of you a great nation. And Abraham does. He does go his own way, and he goes back to the sex slave, right? And God says, does He turn His back? No, and He doesn't turn His back on him. He comes to Abraham and says, Abraham, what have you done? Abraham explains, and he says, and God, because He's with us and in the story and part of the story, He says to him, not only are we going to keep this thing going, I'm going to give you Isaac and it's still going to work, but now I'm going to take care of what you have done and the consequence and the sin in Ishmael. And God goes with Hagar and with Ishmael and makes them a people on their own. And He's with them, He's loving them, He's taking care of them. Far from turning them away, He's going with them. Got to keep the story going. There's David again. And we said, David, I'm going to make you a great king, and out of you is going to come the Messiah. David loves hot tubs, turns away. And there is a consequence, isn't there? The boy dies. Bathsheba's son dies. And there's no doubt that there's a consequence. The wages of sin still matter. There's still death. But far from turning His back on him, God comes to him. And guess who the Messiah comes from in that scenario? From Bathsheba, the one he sinned with. And even though he sends Uriah to the wars and gets him killed, God's reaction is not turning, but joining him in it. I will come into your story and I will make this story happen. And I will redeem it and make good, because that's who I am. I'm a God of love and mercy, and I'm always with you. In fact, that expression with you comes out when here's the people of Israel, and they have sinned And man, have they messed it up over and over and over again. Israel just can't get it right. And they're about to be taken off into captivity and first invaded, and then later part of them are taken off into captivity. And what's God's response to all of that? The book of Isaiah tells us, he comes back to his people and says, I have known you from the beginning. I have not forgotten you. I remember when you were little in mine and taking your first steps, and I still love you. And that's where we get the first expression of this going on, where God says, I'm going to give you someone who's going to come along, and he's going to be called Emmanuel. And there in Isaiah 7, we have the first recording of this fantastic expression, Emmanuel. Because that's what's reflected of God's heart has always been. Every time someone turns from God, the entire people, God comes back to them. And he says, I'm with you, and I'm in it, and I'm with you. And they turn again, and he says, that's okay, I'm still with you. And there it is, I know the plans I have for you. Yeah, but we're still turning. That's okay, I'm still with you until we come to the culmination. And one holy night, away in a manger, the first Noel. I think that's funny, I don't know, it just makes me laugh. You guys are a tough audience. God does something extraordinary on the first Noel. God becomes man. And now the whole story changes, doesn't it? Because now he's fully God and he's fully man. And all the love that he has can flow out of him into the situation. And everything that's true about humanity is not true about God. Everything that's true about God is also true about man, as it's going to happen. But here's an interesting thing. So here's the story of Jesus, and my chairs don't quite fit. How's that look? Pretty good? That'll work. So here in the New Testament, we have the stories, and here's the God-man, right? Here's Emmanuel. And here's a tax collector. Here's a guy who says, I've betrayed not only God, but I've betrayed my people. My name's Matthew. I like to rob from everybody and make it up my own, make it all my own stuff. And he's turned from the God's ways, and he's turned from God entirely, and he's betrayed his own people. And what's Emmanuel's response to him? Matthew, come follow me. Right? And there's a woman at the well sitting in Samaria, and she's, wow, talk about turn from God. She's a half caste. She's only part Jew. And all the Jews can't stand the Samaritans. And my goodness, it's a big, bad mess. And not only is she that socially, but in her own heart, she's turned from God. She's had 5 husbands, and the one she's with is not her own husband. And she couldn't be more removed. In fact, she goes to the well at the height of the day. Why? Because no one else wants to be around her. Not even her own people want to be around her. And so she goes to the well, and she couldn't be more turned from God. And what does the God Emmanuel do? He comes and sits down and asks for a drink of water. And he says, I see you. I hear you, I know you, and actually I'm quite glad to be with you. And that's the story of Emmanuel and the woman at the well, and it goes on and on, isn't it? There's the fisherman Peter who's got a temper like crazy, right? And he loves God, means well, but he keeps turning and blowing things up. And the worst one, of course, is that one night where he's betraying Jesus. And boy, could you be more turned from Jesus than that when you say, I didn't even know the guy. And not just once, but 3 times he does it. And a little bit later in this story, but still the same idea, what happens? The God Emmanuel comes to him and says, Peter, do you love me? But this disease of sin still reigns, and humanity is still completely against God. And sin as a disease is powerful and crazy and nuts and ruins everything. And so humanity now can't take the idea that God would be loving and forgiving, that God would be holy, just, and righteous, sure, but doing it in a loving way that says, I'm always with you, I'm always for you, I'm always among you. And so humanity deals its worst. And in the form of Jewish leadership and Roman soldiers, they take Jesus, the God Emmanuel, and they do their worst to him. And in that day, what's the worst they can devise? Crucifixion. a hideous, disgusting method of torture. And it's humanity that puts Jesus, the Emmanuel, on the cross. And now here's the question we have. I can't do this in chairs very well, or at least I haven't thought about how to do it yet. But the question I want to address is, what about Jesus' words on the cross when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you turned? Interesting words about that. Jesus is actually quoting Psalm 22. And there he is hanging on the cross, barely able to breathe. And so he doesn't go through all 26 verses or whatever, how many it is. But if we keep reading Psalm 22, we get to Psalm 22, we get to verse 22. And in verse 22, Jesus is saying, so here's the prophecy of my crucifixion, and they're dividing my garments, and my bones are melting like wax. And it's a prophecy of the crucifixion, which Jesus is experiencing. So when he says, in quoting verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? If we keep reading the rest of that psalm, we see God's response, which is that in the psalmist, David is praising God for not rejecting his afflicted. So I submit to you, and from Jesus' own words from the Gospel of John, where he says, you will scatter and betray me, you will go and leave me, but my Father will never turn his back on me. So I'd suggest to you that what we see there on the cross is the whole psalm, ending with, my God, you forsake me, but guess what? You'll never leave your afflicted. And so when Jesus, as the God-man, now goes into the grave, God the Father hasn't abandoned him. In fact, now what we have here is utter controversy. Because now God has gone into the place where only man has gone before, where it's actually the realm of Hades and death. He's gone into the place where actually death was the king. But mankind has always gone there, but now God is there. God has gone into the grave. And there in the grave, you get this fantastic expression that says, lift up your gates, open wide your doors. The King of glory has come forth. And the powerful reality is that now death belongs to Jesus. Death belongs to God. In fact, when he's raised from the grave, he now says, doesn't he? All authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. Right there in the Great Commission, Matthew 28. All authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. And then we see in Revelation chapter 1 where he says, I hold the keys of death and hell. So you see the difference in this story is that now God is everywhere. And the God-man who is always with us, who is Emmanuel, who is God present, God with, God knowing us in every situation, there's no place that he's not, even in death. Isn't that what the psalmist says in prophetic terms? Where can I go to escape from you? If I descend to the grave, there you are. And that's the reality that we live in today, friends. That's the profound reality that we live in, that God is Emmanuel. God is the gospel of Emmanuel. And guess what? It applies to not just back then, or it applies not just to the beginning of our journey. Because let me tell you another little quick story. Here's a man in his late 30s. And he loves God. And he has wanted to serve God since he was 15 years old. He's in his late 30s, 20 years of following Jesus, Bible college, seminary, church planter, pastor, just started as a missionary. But nothing's working for this man in his late 30s. Nothing's working. Family's kind of a struggling thing. Ministry's a struggling thing. Not really working. Ready to leave ministry. Let's do something else. And the reality is that he is on the edge. And this 30-year-old man says, in his late 30s, he says, you know what, I just don't know if I can do this anymore. And his man's name is Roy. This man is me. And I sat there looking at the loaded gun. And I said, God, turns out you're just really ticked at me all the time anyway. I mean, really, you would be mad at me if it wasn't for Jesus. So, God, I'm not sure you really matter. I mean, I don't know. And it was only the thought of my children and orphaning them that locked things back up again. And my wife, having seen this, was terrified, and she, of course, why wouldn't she be? She called Darlene, and Darlene told Steve, and Steve and David came over to my house, and guess what? They showed up and were Emmanuel to me. And Pastor Steve and Pastor David sat in my back patio and said, Roy, are you okay, brother? And you see what they did and helped me do, and others have done. My order, Imago Christi, has helped me do. They have helped me put God inside the other chair. So now the Emmanuel is inside of me. And friends, let me tell you, you don't encounter Jesus and walk away unchanged. Depression, thanks be to God, is a thing of the past. Anxiety in the rearview mirror. Purpose and excitement and joy and the ability to work and minister and live has transformed my life because the gospel of Emmanuel comes into me and says, you know what? We can change everything. We can set the captives free and give sight to the blind and restore life to the way it's meant to be. This is the gospel of Emmanuel. This is the gospel that he's inviting you to share in, to participate in. And even if you've already asked Jesus into your heart, consider that it's your entire life. This is the beauty of it. And guess what? You take it out of this place and you go to be a high school teacher. And you are the mission of Emmanuel. You are the gospel of the good news in that high school, right? Or you're a stay-at-home mom and you raise your children and you take them to school and soccer, etc. And Emmanuel's inside of you, and that's your mission. The power of Jesus Christ living inside of you. And maybe you're, whatever it is that you do, no matter where you go, whatever you're doing, you're a businessman, a businesswoman, you're a lawyer, you're a teacher, you're a counselor. Whatever it is that you do, everywhere you go now, the gospel of Emmanuel follows you along. Because he's inside of you, and he's changing you, and he's showing you that there's a hope and a joy and a transformation that can take place. This is just my personal experience, but I've never seen transformation take place from the first story. Yes, people come to know Jesus, but they always wrestle with who God is. But in this story, where Jesus is in our lives, and he's Emmanuel, and he's a part of it, this is where transformation takes place. And that's our invitation. And so, what I want to invite us to as we finish up this morning is I want to invite you to come to the seminars I'm doing the next 2 Sundays. There's identical seminars in the morning, first service and the second service. They're the same thing. But in there, I want to give you some tools to help you experience Emmanuel and to experience the gospel of Emmanuel. Give you some prayer tools that help you. It starts with simple gratitude. So come to those seminars, and then the following week we'll go a bit deeper, doing the same thing where the 2 services matches. So thanks for letting me share this morning. God bless.